So, have I told you all how much I enjoyed last year's sermon series on white supremacy culture? I did. I loved it. Well, it started as a way for me and us to live into our board's goal of living into our newest 8th principle of dismantling racism. It turned into an opportunity to stretch my own thinking and most of to create an ongoing conversation with you all. So I really loved each time you would say, yes, that one spoke to me on urgency, but this written word thing I'm really struggling with. And we continued a conversation throughout the year. So it was a bit of pressure to find another topic for this year, something that could be very different, but could aid in taking our conversations to a deeper level. What I was looking for was a way to address this feeling that I've had, and I'm imagining that you've had as well, about just how challenging our world is right now. There are so many, right? Right. Come on, like it's so much, and thing after thing. There are so many things that make me feel hopeless right now. Between wars in Ukraine and continuing wars in the rest of the world, climate change and the impacts, divisive politics, the eroding of our democracy, authoritarianism, blatant racism, economic inequality. And this is all without talking about the impact of the pandemic that it's had on us individually and how it has made every single one of those more challenging. Each day it feels like we need to guard and protect our hope, our hearts, and our minds from the continuing flow of news that makes us sometimes feel hopeless. Anyone else? Anyone else feeling it? Preach it, right? And yet, it turns out that it is my job to bring you hope. So that's no easy job in these times. And not just personally, bring you personally with whatever you're going through hope, but us collectively as a society, as a community, as a nation, as a world. How can I bring hope that we can be kinder, more just, more liberating to each other? How is it that we can live into the promise of what we know ourselves to be, that of collective liberation? So for this series, I'm not coming up with it on my own. I'm going to be looking at hope from the views of different world religions each time. About once a month, I have a little flexibility on that. I will be drawing from many sources for this. I'm going to be looking at it particularly through a collective liberation lens. I might be drawing from James Cone and his concept of Black liberation from the 1970s. And Miguel de la Torre and his writing of Latinx liberation from the 1990s. And I am going to be drawing heavily from de la Torre's brilliant collection of essays entitled The Hope of Liberation in World Religions. Now, I'm a little prejudiced on this because Miguel de la Torre was one of my professors in seminary. He happens to be a very famous theologian. He's a radical, a Cuban, a Baptist minister, and he challenges us to constantly look at our faith from the perspectives of those on the margins. He has brought in for this book all kinds of leading scholars and practitioners of different world religions to explore what those religions have to say about liberation and where we can find hope from that. This year, I have hope that we will get to explore humanism, Latin American Catholicism, the Black Church, Islam, Buddhism, Native American theology, Judaism, and African traditional religion, exploring them all as sources of hope and liberation. So I want to start with some collective understanding in this critical question. What is collective liberation? Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality." The great civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer said that nobody's free until everyone's free. In her speech, she paid tribute to Black women in Mississippi who started the ball rolling with regard to civil rights, activism, as well as white women who woke up to the white male patriarchal oppression. This was in 1971, and we are still waking. It is this collective liberation that I need hope in right now. It is that sense that we are the people who are rooting for other people, that like our children taught us that we are trying to find ways to be fair, to make sure that everyone has a special stone. In the rise of evangelicalism and neoliberalism, I can talk, I swear. Let me try this. Neoliberalism, we are seeing the exponential increase of individualism in financial institutions, multinational corporations, and mass media. De La Torre says that all of these economic arrangements, more often than not, dehumanize those made poor. When the world's disenfranchised are commodified, cultural consequences follow, specifically in the disintegration of communal and familial life. So let's talk about liberation theology, all right? I've preached once before about liberation theology. You can tell it's kind of important, but it's also very much where our Unitarian Universalist principles lie. De La Torre says that there's 5 general concepts to liberal theology. First is liberation as salvation. Now, Susan Goldsmith next week is going to get into salvation from a UU perspective. You all don't want to miss it. It's going to be really great. But liberation theology says liberation must be from all forms of oppression, specifically political, sexual, economic, environmental, and religious. So liberation is salvation. Second of all theologies are contextual. Since liberation theology is always grassroots, it's important that we explore the context that it comes from. That's why we're going to explore liberation from the context of all of these different world religions. 3, emphasis on action rather than doctrine. Now, you all are experts at this. De La Torre says, contrary to the deductive methodology employed by the dominant culture's theology, which begins with a truth, doctrine, scripture, or church teaching, and then moves towards creating action, liberationists begin with the experience of the poor and the oppressed. That means we're not starting with scripture that's calling us to action. We're starting with the action that's happening in the world and bringing that into our theology. 4, related to that is the preferential treatment for the poor. Liberation theology says that if there is a God, it is the God of the poor. And 5, which is the reality of institutional violence. Latinx liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez says that violence is more than physical abuse. It incorporates the long-term violence imposed by political, social, and economic institutions that foster death through the denial of basic human needs. Wow. Okay, so that was a super quick romp through liberation theology. You guys got it? Good? We got it? We know everything that we need about liberation. We're on. Let's go. Let's go. So how does it apply now? So for this first week, I wanted to focus a little bit more on what liberation meant so that we have that common context. And I want to be honest, what I really wanted to talk about today was about how Judaism talks about liberation because of the High Holy Days this week. But the truth is I needed to explore this concept of liberation theology, collective liberation, a little bit more, and that meant that I was going to have to give less time to Judaism. which is not fair because liberation is one of the central points of Judaism. So bookmark that now. We're going to explore that later when we can go into liberation. Exodus will be part of it. I'm just saying. We'll be exploring that later. Instead, today, I want to explore something where liberation is more easily understood by many of you, which is humanism. In De La Torre's book, the chapter on humanism is written by Anthony Pinn, who's a professor of religious studies at Rice University. He has 17 books, including African American humanist principles. He is looking at humanism through a distinctly African American lens, which was very insightful for me. Indeed, it was a sign of my own white supremacy culture that I thought of humanism as a white theology or perspective. So let's turn that on its head, shall we? Pinn grounds the humanist development in the civil rights movement, where Black churches were called to give an account of their commitment to human progress. It involved a sense of the collective, communal concern with transformation, as opposed to the racial individualism of the religious kind of otherworldly orientation. He names Martin Luther King and Ella Baker as influencers in his. Pinn says that Black theology and womanist theology, look into it, queer, Black, female perspective, very cool, created a worldly liberal view, and that they recognize the manner in which the historical progress of the human race has taken place at the expense of particular groups, not within the circle of dominance. It is a recognition that human progress has tended to produce a bloody trail from Europe through Africa and into the Americas, and freedom of thought and belief must acknowledge, follow, and redeem this bloody trail. Now, humanism separated from the more Christian theologies eventually. Pinn said that this is situated, instead of being otherworldly, it is inherently this worldly. It is calling forth of our human promise and pitfalls. It is pointing out the emptiness of God, like God's absence, literally. Like if God's not there, then it calls for us as humans to fill the void as best they can. Humanism acknowledges that we must nurture life in its various forms. It names a desire for health and well-being, acknowledging that this means that it is not fully within our grasp. And Pinn says that humanism centers on concern for the community as the ultimate orientation for life. The community as orientation for life. Does that sound familiar to any of us here? It is a recognition of the interconnectedness of all forms of life, the nurturing of this web of existence. That is the preoccupation of humanism, providing both a theological anchor and a motivation for ethics. Humanism encourages a view of the world that seeks to promote healing and balance for all forms of life. So where does the optimism come? Optimism from humanism comes from an appreciation of humanity's tenacity, humanity's potential to recognize and address many layers of oppression. It is living a life of integrity, not just with those of one's own community, but with those of all communities, that gives us hope and direction. Reverend Dr. Jay Hooper, the first Black humanist chaplain serving the Minneapolis, Minnesota community, says this about his humanism. Like some on the humanist spectrum, I revere reason and rationale. I believe the place where love meets wisdom is holy ground. These formations of meaning undergird my practice of serving and compassion as a chaplain. Reverend Hooper was in Minnesota in the days following the murder of George Floyd. And as the chaplain, many people came up to him and asked him to pray. This is the humanist prayer that he came up with during those difficult times. Let us take this moment to share and witness each other's life and greatness. May we honor the opportunity to share in the inherited worth or dignity of each other's knowledge and compassion. For this is a moment of deep concern that requires comfort and a practice of peace and compassion to confront our sorrows. Let us see in this moment that we are enough, and we are in this together. There is nothing that we cannot do if we work together for the good in each other. Let us be all we need in this moment. So from a humanist lens, let us be the community for each other. Let us be the hope for each other. Let us build the liberation for all, for each other. Let it be so.